Hello from the Centre for Hellenic Studies at King's College London. Today it is a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Vally Lytra, who's actually an alumna of the program here at King's. She's currently a reader in languages in education in the Department for Educational Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. She has done a lot of field work in Greece, in the UK, and in Switzerland. She focuses on school environments, home environments, and communities where issues of migration flows and languages intersect. She's also interested in issues of family language policy, which I think is a spectacular term, and issues of diaspora language learning. And most recently, she's engaged in a project on teachers and parents' special responsibilities when handling online learning during a pandemic. She is also a co-author and contributor to this fascinating book that just came out, in which she has a substantial contribution in the introduction, but also a chapter called Making Sense of the Internal Diversities of Greek Schools Abroad, exploring the purposeful use of translation as communicative resource for language learning and identity construction. It is literally hot off the press, and our purpose today in this interview is to ask her some questions about it. Call this a virtual book launch without the glass of wine at the end. So then, Vally, well, thank you so much for doing this. The book is called Liberating Language Education. Every word is important there, but I'm particularly struck by the liberating. Why? What kind of initiative or vision underpins this collaborative project? And where did the authors kind of perceive a need for this book? Who do they hope to reach?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this lovely introduction, and of course for the invitation to come and talk to you about our new edited book. As Gonda said, I'm an alumni of the at the time Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. So it's a real pleasure to be back. Even virtually, to talk about the book. So yes, as you said, the book is called Liberating Language Education. And I think the idea behind it was that we live and work and learn in times of really heightened linguistic and cultural diversity and mobilities, and increased linguistic and social inequalities. And what we observed was that very often dominant models of language and language education really fail to take into account these massive social and cultural changes, and then how these changes come to affect teaching and learning. So you mentioned my own chapter in that book, and just to give you an example, in my own work, I've been really interested in looking at the internal diversities of Greek community schools. These are schools that are set up by Greek diaspora communities to support children's language, culture, and heritage maintenance in the diaspora. And then how the transnational mobilities post-2009, that's after the financial crisis, but also the educational policies that resulted as a result, if you like, of the financial crisis in Greece, how they've really brought in new processes around Greek community language education. So we see now that these changes have led to processes of privatization, of commodification, but also of individualization of Greek language education abroad. So, of course, these processes open some really interesting questions about, what kinds of new forms of educational provision are we looking at? What kind of mission statements for different kinds of provision, different kinds of schools that are opening up? What kind of teaching methods and approaches to meet the really diverse needs of and expectations and aspirations, of course, of different groups of learners, and not only children, but also adult learners of Greek. So it's really thinking about how all these changes are affecting language education and really pushing us away from more dominant models of language and language learning. So I think a guiding question for us when we were putting this edited collection together was, how can we reimagine language and language education under such conditions of instability and change, rapid change? And I think coming back to your question, what kind of vision underpins our call for liberating language education? We often think about language and language education through a lens of kind of ordered categorization of languages, cultures, and identities. So you speak Greek, you are Greek. Greek culture and language is often perceived as unified, Greek identities as fixed. So we wanted our book to challenge such dominant paradigms of language and culture and language education, which really often draw from these static representations of languages and cultures and identities and communities, and also challenge more prescriptivist pedagogical models and language assessment models. So the idea of liberating comes through interrogating dominant monolingual and prescriptivist ideologies about how we understand languages, and then the next, of course, question is how we should teach languages. Yeah. So in our vision of language education, and the one that we as editors, but also the contributors to the book espouse, this vision, if you like, proposes to sort of encourage learners and teachers to be proactive, to work collaboratively in constructing their learning environments, which in that way will better reflect their own desires, their own worlds, their own identities. And in this way, teachers and learners can become what we've talked a little bit about this in the introduction of the book, active policy agents. And of course, we don't want to overemphasize agency, student agency or teacher agency, because obviously teachers and learners, they too have to battle against, often monolingualizing institutional policies and ideologies and practices, which can constrain their multilingualism and the potential of using multiple multilingual resources in teaching and learning. So yes, so I think this is kind of the way that we've thought about the idea of liberating, and I think we see our book as contributing to current discussions in applied linguistics and social linguistics that also calls for the need to harness the pedagogical potential of multilingual and multimodal repertoires, as well as aesthetic resources of learners and teachers. So this is also part of the kind of liberating language education process, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we propose to understand language kind of later in our discussion. But this is also kind of an aspect of liberating language education that we see very important, looking at language resources as part of a broader communicative repertoire that learners and teachers have at their disposal and can harness for pedagogical purposes. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. I get a sense of a strong team with shared interests. And what are the kind of details or special features of the book that you as a team and you as a member of that team needed to decide on? Where did you want to go to make this book stand out and kind of make a different impression on the reader?
Okay, so I think our point of departure was certainly a more inclusive view of language and language education. Again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about kind of rejecting static and monolithic versions of languages, cultures, and identities. And I think one of the, and added to this, one of the strengths of the book is that it seeks to challenge binaries. So binaries, for instance, is between formal and informal learning, home and school literacies, or schools and other sites of learning. So, for instance, several chapters in the book really make visible the work that is being done in complementary community school settings, for instance, which are important sites for learning to maintain home languages and cultures and support learners' bilingual, multilingual development. I think another sort of kind of important feature of the book is that it draws on interdisciplinary approaches. So quite a few chapters talk about arts-based approaches to pedagogy, thematic or project-based language learning approaches, and really try to show how these approaches might work in classrooms and how it might look like when teachers and learners exploit these opportunities for creative use and for critical use and for sort of using digital media, for instance, in teaching and learning, but also what does it mean to collaborate beyond with agents beyond the school and classroom. So what happens when teachers collaborate with museum educators and gallery educators and other organizations that are outside of kind of the school setting, and how and ultimately I think what's really important is how we can achieve a more synergetic relationship between language and culture learning. So this is really a thread that runs out of runs through the book chapters. And I think another thing that I think is important, perhaps is important to mention, is that the book supports a decolonizing stance in the way that, in the sense that it supports multiple ways of knowing, if you like. And although we talk about proposing a translingual and transcultural orientation to language and pedagogy, we don't see this as a framework that is prescriptive, but more so as a series of elements, if you like, that work together to allow for more flexible, more creative, more critical pedagogical sort of interactions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I very much liked the boldness with which the authors have pursued, both for their research and writing, unconventional settings, some of which you already mentioned, really pushing beyond the classrooms. You mentioned museums, but also there is talk of cafes, art workshops, play and theater settings, and then, of course, online settings and digital media. There's a clear sense that new space and new content interact, and of course new methods. And then with that richness you also bring in a multivocality of languages: Creole, Portuguese, Greek, Arabic, clearly not necessarily the most obvious languages. So there is a lot of diversity and inclusion in this book. And so can you reflect a little bit on the kind of alternative pathways that these bold approaches throw open?
Okay, all right. So maybe I'll start with the second sort of bit of the question first, the one where you talk about the many languages, because I think what we definitely we were really interested in, what you talk about in terms of a multilingual approach. So and I think in many ways the book pushes against dominant monolingual paradigms, the so-called monolingual norm, that monolingualism is the norm. And it really pushes against this reluctance sometimes especially by educators, by teachers, to acknowledge that actually multilingual language use is normal and everyday, and to really challenge the kind of deficit constructions that often come about to characterize language learners because of their multilingual resources. So I think we wanted in this book not only to kind of recognize the centrality of multilingualism and multilingual practices and identities, and think about this, consider it as the point of departure, as the norm rather than the exception. But also to look at how multilingualism and multilingual resources can actually be leveraged pedagogically. And really, we wanted to sort of counter the kind of the effects of the monolingual norm that very often restricts the possibilities, the pedagogical possibilities of multilingual children to leverage all their linguistic resources for learning. And I think a good example, one of the chapters in the book by a former PhD student of ours, Thomas Quell, he looks at what happens, for instance, when this monolingual norm is in the mainstream classroom is combined with kind of a symbolic take on multilingualism, a kind of and creates a kind of multilingualism discourse. He calls it multilingualism light, which on the one hand acknowledges children's multilingual repertoires, but it doesn't really leverage them, use them in a systematic way to create teaching and learning opportunities. So we wanted to sort of highlight this aspect, the need to sort of counter these monolingualizing ideologies, but also I think, and that kind of leads to your earlier question. The other thing that we were trying to do in the book is also to rethink language and really kind of broaden our understanding of multilingualism to include and encompass teachers and learners full semiotic repertoires, aesthetic resources, multilingual practices, which we see we see language is very much entangled with other semiotic resources. So a lot of chapters really delve into these different entanglements. So what happens when languages and other semiotic resources and artifacts in the environment come together and create language learning and opportunities. So because of this kind of orientation, looking at multilingualism as everyday normalcy, as everyday practice, looking at language as part of a broader semiotic repertoire, it seemed very natural for us, if you like, to invite contributors who don't see language education as confined only to the language classroom. I know that in most of our minds, language learning is what we learn in school. So we actually wanted to look at language learning across multiple sites, including the social spaces you mentioned, home, community spaces, cafes, language cafes, but also virtual spaces that are becoming increasingly more and more popular and studied, well studied. So I think this kind of broader view of language and language learning allows us to look at language learning across the lifespan, look at language learning as a situated, context-dependent process, a process that is provisional and really never complete, because you can never say a language, because different bits and registers and ways of speaking in a language. In the same way that a language, you can also lose it. You can also forget a language. So it's within this context that we wanted to broaden our sites of language learning and include, sort of perhaps less studied sites. I mean, for instance, you know, the study that you mentioned about the language cafes by Nuria Polo Perez and Prue Holmes really looks at language cafes as spaces for language socialization, where multilingual speakers come together to practice their languages, but also very often they talk about their emotions, about, you know, how they feel about their different languages, and and what it means to become socialized into another language. What kind of sort of affective stances does this this sort of trigger? So yeah, so I think so that's kind of our kind of guiding principles for bringing these different studies together. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Is there anything we haven't covered yet, or do you feel we've been pretty complete?
I can tell you a little bit about how the book came about, if that's something that might be of interest to and sort of talk a little bit about, you know, the different how the book, I think, how the book came about. So we're a group of four editors. We all work at the Center for Language, Culture and Learning at Goldsmiths University. We're all in sort of, we're all interested in language and literacy learning. We wanted to sort of bring in our different perspectives and expertise into this one book. And really, I think in many ways, the book was also anchored in our own biographies as language learners across the lifespan. And I think who we are as researchers very often motivates the kind of questions we ask and the kind of research foci that we investigate. So, and we talk a little bit about this in the introduction to the book, and we do that through taking up a different persona. So I became the weaver, Christina Rossi Soleil became the fool, Jim Anderson became the traveler, and Vicky McElroy became the activist. And you might ask, well, why the weaver? And I think for me, it kind of best represents how I understand languages and language education, and how that is very much linked to my own biography. So when I was a 4-year-old child, I moved to England with my mother, who was pursuing her postgraduate studies at the time. And as a young child who would nowadays be called an EAL child, because I had no prior knowledge of English or contact with English before coming to England at the age of 4, I found myself trying to make sense of a new language and a new sort of cultural environment. And I remember my family always said that I was a very reluctant speaker of English when I started out these first 6 months, which is not surprising. But then I quickly adapted to my new environment. And then by the second year, which was the equivalent of reception year, I already started reading in English, and I was very much in line with my peers. So, but the interesting thing happened when I returned to Greece, and people would hear me speak English, and they would always ask, you know, how come I spoke such good English? And they would praise me for my native, quote unquote, English accent. And this kind of astonishment and praise continued for many years. And of course, it was a source of immense pride and joy for me and my brother later, who went through the same process. And really a huge motivational factor for both of us to continue on developing our so-called good English. And of course, it's not surprising because it was linked to very sort of positive presentations of self. But of course, thinking back and perhaps with a more critical stance, I think these evaluations were perhaps my first encounter with what it means to speak a language that has a particular prestige associated with it, sort of a global language. And of course, I think in many ways this encounter has also informed my research interest on how language resources become hierarchized. What are the social values that are attached to some resources that makes them to be considered more valuable or more desirable than others? And of course, the power of these social valuations to not only to position languages, but also to position their speakers, and give some speakers the sense of pride and joy that I got, and those who don't get so positive valuations about their ways of speaking get more negative feel more negatively or less motivated about their language resources, the ways they speak. And of course, these language valuations have nothing to do with the language per se. There's nothing inherent in English or Greek or particular varieties of these languages that make them better or worse. But it's really how these ways of speaking are socially constructed. So we see, and I think education is a very good example of this, how standard varieties of majority languages are considered more valuable resources in educational settings compared to, let's say, non-standard varieties or minority languages. And of course, these valuations have important consequences for how we value languages and their speakers in society and in education, and ultimately whose experiences get listened to and whose experiences become marginalized or silenced. So I think my own interest in the social valuation of languages perhaps goes back to my own experiences as an emergent bilingual at the time. And it also informs the part of the book that I have edited. So the book is comprised of 4 parts. Each of the editors was responsible for one part. And in my sort of section, I wanted really to focus on how teachers and learners negotiate and enact policies and discourses and ideologies about multilingualism, language diversity, and language learning in schools and classrooms. So that was kind of my my little story about how I ended up doing this particular section for the book.
Excellent, thank you. Well, before we close, I want to refer our viewers and listeners again to this fascinating new book that really puts a very modern, very 2022, 2021, post-pandemic, hopefully, spin on language education and language learning. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you.
And do get in touch.